So, I've had some discussions with theists recently, off of YouTube, of course, and they said something interesting to me, which I have heard many times before, both on and off of YouTube. When I offered them the multitude of reasons why I could not possibly believe their God exists, why I couldn't even begin to accept the possibility that a God exists, let alone theirs. They asked me, what proof do you have to show that my God doesn't exist? Now, there are two ways that an atheist could tackle this, and both I think are very fair and very reasonable. The first is to say the burden of proof is not on the non-believer to show that a God doesn't exist. It is on the person making a positive claim. So if they're claiming that a God exists, they must provide evidence. Again, perfectly reasonable in my eyes, but you know what? I think a lot of theists don't seem to like this explanation very much. I think they do not either understand the concept of burden of proof, or they do not wish to understand the concept of burden of proof. So, in the other instance, I could use an example to highlight why the atheist should not be responsible for providing evidence of the non-existence of a god or gods. So picture this. This is a pen I have in my hands. You guys can see the pen. The pen exists for all intents and purposes. Now, of course, these could be some very fancy video graphics if I was into special effects, and I could edit this pen in my hands right now. But that's very unlikely considering I can write with the pen. Of course, I can write with the pen. I could show you that this pen works. You can hear that the pen can click. You can hear that the pen makes a sound when it hits my hand. So for all intents and purposes, it's fairly reasonable to assume that I am holding a pen in my hand, even though there is a remote possibility that that might not be the case. In other words, there's very strong evidence that this thing exists, and even if I were to edit this into my hands and I wasn't really holding a pen, one could come over to my house, for instance, and ask me if I had a pen like this, and then I would show them this pen. Now, imagine this pen is God, Jesus, or any other god or gods that maybe had existed at one point or currently supposedly does exist. So, would it be sufficient to say that Jesus existed if there was this amount of evidence to show that Jesus existed? Yeah, I would say so. If I could see Jesus in front of me, if I could touch Jesus, if I could feel that this was a real person that may have been the Son of God, if I could hear Jesus' voice, and it was verified by other people that I was not simply hallucinating, that a lot of people saw the exact same thing at the exact time and described almost verbatim exactly what I saw, that would be very strong evidence to show that Jesus Christ existed. There's only one slight problem. We don't have such evidence. We have never really actually seen Jesus Christ before, and any testimony that says that Jesus Christ existed can be easily associated with confirmation bias. Likewise, any trace that Jesus Christ might have left if he really walked the earth has simply vanished. We've not found archaeological evidence, at least not solid archaeological evidence, that Jesus Christ ever existed. We have not found any traces of DNA anywhere. We have not found any traces that a man named Jesus Christ from Nazareth even existed. And to be quite honest, the only source of supposed evidence that Jesus Christ has for his existence is the Bible. And let's face it, of course the Bible would want you to believe that Jesus Christ existed. That's kind of the core basis of what it tries to teach. Using my pen as the example again, so if none of you saw this pen, which is sitting right next to me on the table, how could I prove that this pen exists? If I refuse to show you the pen, if I refuse to allow you to come into my house and see the pen for yourself, if by all accounts I do not show you any evidence, any reasonable evidence, that this pen exists. Well, how could you possibly accept the notion that this pen is actually real? Now, of course, if I refuse to show you evidence that the pen was in front of me, and you guys never saw evidence, that's not to say that the pen doesn't exist. Obviously, the pen does. And that's the same with God and Jesus and every other God. There will always be a very remote possibility that Jesus and God doesn't exist, even if I can't see it or other atheists can't see it, and we just simply do not see the supposed evidence that believers offer in front of us as legitimate. Yeah, there might be a possibility that God or Jesus might exist. But honestly, I think it's only reasonable for atheists to assume otherwise, that God doesn't exist, unless evidence can be shown that it does. Why? So, two reasons. One is because we would be assuming that anything, anywhere, at any time, by any means, could possibly exist. And if we were to make that assumption, then everything would pretty much lose its meaning. Like, what does it mean to say that a flying teapot is hovering above the earth? Well, can you prove it? No. Well, can you show any evidence that shows that it exists? No. Well, can you prove me wrong? Well, no, I can't prove that a flying teapot doesn't exist on top of the earth, but it would be silly to assume that it does because there hasn't been any evidence to show otherwise. Secondly, which is related to the first, is that theists would not be dumb enough to believe their own logic had it not been for the fact that their God was in question. So, my example would be, if I told a theist that the sky was not in fact a set of layers of atmospheric gases and whatnot, and instead was a giant floating carpet from Aladdin, no one would be dumb enough to say, well, since I didn't see any evidence that shows that it's not true, I can safely say that the carpet in the sky is a very real possibility. Then you would sound like a complete dumbass. And not to mention that it is illogical in the sense that there should be no reason to assume existence if there is no evidence to be shown. I have said it before, and I'll say it again. I think Hitchens was dead on when he said what can be asserted without evidence can be equally dismissed without evidence. And that is true regardless of what the claim is. If it's a theological claim, if it's a non-theological claim, if it's a claim of existence, whether it's supernatural or not, these claims demand evidence. And if you don't have any evidence, then our conversation is over. May the truth always be heard.